Sam's tiny fingers tightened around his father's hand, clinging to the warmth and safety it offered as they navigated the crowded airport. The air was thick with the scent of jet fuel and overpriced coffee, mingling with the chatter of travelers rushing to destinations he could only dream about. People moved in all directions, dragging suitcases, clutching tickets, shouting last-minute goodbyes. It was a world of movement, of possibilities, of adventures he'd only seen in the comics tucked away in his Spider-Man backpack. He'd always loved airports. The energy, the endless parade of strangers with lives so different from his own. Whenever he and his dad drove by one, he'd stare longingly at the planes soaring above, wishing he could join them and see the world. But their trips here were usually brief. His father picking up or dropping off some relative Sam had barely known. Today was different. Today, his father's shoulders were tense, his voice thin and strained, like a wire pulled too tight. Sam glanced up at his father, catching the crease in his brow, the flicker of nerves in his dark eyes. His father's faded brown jacket looked older than ever, fraying at the cuffs and elbows. A loose thread dangled from the sleeve, and Sam kept playing with it, rolling it between his fingers, his own small way of keeping calm. "Stay close, buddy," his father murmured, his voice thick with something Sam couldn't name. Worry? Regret? Fear? Sam couldn't tell. He was only 8 after all, and his father had always been the one with the answers, the one who made everything right. The man who read bedtime stories in funny voices and held him tight when thunderstorms shook their old apartment windows. They pushed through the bustling terminal until they reached a row of hard plastic chairs bolted to the floor beneath a massive digital clock that glowed 9:47 a.m. in harsh red numbers. His father guided him down into one of the cold chairs, then dropped Sam's backpack beside him with a clumsy thud. "Okay, Sam, I need you to stay right here," his father said, crouching down to meet his son's eyes. His hands were firm on Sam's shoulders, his fingers trembling ever so slightly. "Don't move from this spot. I'll be back before you know it." "Where are you going?" Sam asked, trying to keep his voice steady. His father's urgency was seeping into him, the anxiety like a shadow crawling over his skin. "I just need to take care of something. Something important," his father replied, his smile strained and fragile. "You'll be okay, right? Remember what I always say." "Thompson men keep their promises," Sam whispered, reciting the line his father had drilled into him since he was old enough to speak. His dad's motto, the one he always said before he left for work or when Sam was scared of the dark. "That's right," his father said, nodding as if to convince himself as much as Sam. "And I'm making a promise to you right now. I'll be back real soon. Just stay put, okay?" Sam nodded reluctantly, his legs swinging just above the polished floor. His father ruffled his hair and kissed his forehead before standing up, his gaze lingering on Sam for a moment longer than usual. And then he was gone, swallowed up by the sea of people moving through the terminal. At first, Sam didn't mind waiting. He pulled his backpack into his lap, unzipped it, and dug out his favorite comic book. The pages were wrinkled from being read 100 times, but the heroes were still as bright and powerful as ever. He let himself get lost in their world, where villains were always defeated and good always triumphed. But as the minutes stretched into hours, his excitement began to wane. The clamor of the airport faded to a dull roar as exhaustion tugged at him. The small pack of cookies his father had given him for breakfast was long gone, and his stomach growled hungrily. He glanced up at the clock again. 12:13 p.m., the bright red numbers seemed almost mocking. His father had been gone for hours, far longer than Sam had expected. He tried to reassure himself. Maybe his dad had gotten lost. Maybe he was stuck in some line, waiting for something important. The crowd thinned as morning gave way to afternoon. Sam's legs had gone numb from sitting so long, and his neck ached from straining to see above the passing waves of people. His father had to be coming back soon. He just had to. By the time the clock read 4:23 p.m., Sam's optimism had crumbled into a dull ache of fear. He'd counted the ceiling tiles above him at least 20 times. He'd made up stories about the people walking by, where they were going, who they were meeting, why they were rushing. Anything to pass the time, to distract himself from the icy truth settling in his gut. His father was still nowhere to be seen. As the sun sank below the horizon, the airport's artificial lights cast eerie shadows along the tiled floors. Sam's body trembled with a cold that had nothing to do with the temperature. His breath hitched as he fought the tears prickling his eyes. Thompson men don't cry, his father always said. But Sam wasn't feeling much like a Thompson man. He was just a scared little boy, lost and alone in a place that had suddenly turned massive and cruel. When the airport announcement blared overhead, calling for final departures, Sam's chest tightened. His throat felt thick and dry, his voice small and cracked when he tried to whisper, "Dad," to the darkness. But his father didn't answer. The world blurred around Sam, colors and sounds twisting into a muddled haze. His feet dangled from the cold, unforgiving chair, swinging back and forth as he hugged his backpack to his chest like a lifeline. His comic book lay forgotten at his feet, its vibrant pages wrinkled and smudged from restless fingers. People came and went, businessmen in sleek suits dragging leather cases, families with children clinging to teddy bears, tourists snapping pictures of nothing in particular. Everyone had somewhere to be, someone waiting for them. Everyone except Sam. His eyes darted to the digital clock again, the red numbers burning into his mind. 5:12 p.m. He should have been home by now, curled up on the worn-out couch with his dad, eating macaroni and cheese while watching their favorite superhero movies. Instead, he was alone, his stomach a twisted knot of hunger and panic. The hours had stretched on like a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. A woman in a bright red uniform, airport staff, Sam guessed, paused in front of him, her eyebrows knitting together as she took in his rumpled clothes and tear-streaked face. "Hey, kiddo. Are you waiting for someone?" Her voice was warm but cautious, like she didn't quite know how to approach him. Sam's throat tightened. "My dad. He went to do something. He told me to wait here." The woman's gaze softened, but there was a hint of worry lurking behind her smile. "How long ago was that?" I don't know." Sam's eyes dropped to his sneakers. "A long time." Her hand twitched like she wanted to reach out, but wasn't sure if it was the right thing to do. "Do you know his name? Or maybe his phone number?" "Yeah. His name is David Thompson. And his number is…" The numbers danced around in Sam's head, blurry and distorted. His dad had made him memorize it once, but right now it felt like trying to grab water with his hands. "It's okay," the woman said gently. "Why don't you come with me, and we'll try to figure things out together." Sam hesitated, his fingers clutching his backpack so tightly his knuckles turned white. His dad had said to wait right there, to stay put no matter what. But the airport had grown cold and unfriendly, and his dad was nowhere to be seen. What if he never came back? What if something terrible had happened? His chest felt heavy, his breaths coming out in shallow, uneven gasps. He bit his lip, forcing himself to nod. "Okay." The woman led him through the terminal, her voice a soft hum, as she tried to distract him with questions about school and superheroes. Sam answered in short, clipped sentences, his mind spinning too fast to focus on anything but the gnawing fear clawing at his insides. They ended up in a small office with walls painted a sickly shade of beige, a couple of plastic chairs, a cluttered desk, and a computer that looked older than Sam himself. Another man in a similar red uniform glanced up from a pile of paperwork, his eyebrows raising at the sight of the small, lost boy standing in the doorway. "This is Sam," the woman explained, her voice low and calm. "He's looking for his dad. Been waiting alone for hours." The man's expression softened. "Hey, buddy, why don't you have a seat? We'll see if we can get a hold of your dad, all right." Sam's feet felt heavy as he shuffled toward one of the chairs. The plastic creaked under his weight as he sat down, his backpack still clutched tightly in his lap. He stared at the man's fingers as they clicked away at the keyboard, the rhythmic tapping of fragile comfort. "What's your dad's name again?" the man asked. "David Thompson," Sam repeated, his voice barely more than a whisper. The man nodded, his eyes glued to the screen. Seconds stretched into minutes, the quiet hum of the office interrupted only by the muffled conversations drifting in from the hallway. The woman handed Sam a cup of water, but his hand shook too much to hold it steady. After what felt like an eternity, the man let out a sigh, his shoulders sagging. "All right, kiddo. Here's the thing. We tried paging your dad, made a few calls, but there's no sign of him anywhere in the terminal. And his name isn't on any passenger list for outgoing flights today." Sam's stomach lurched, his voice trembling. But he promised he'd be back. He wouldn't just leave me. "I'm sure he didn't mean to leave you here," the woman said quickly, her eyes darting toward her colleague. "Sometimes things happen, you know. But we're going to do everything we can to find him. I promise." Another promise. The words twisted inside Sam like a knife. His dad had promised to come back, and now this lady was promising to help him find him. But promises felt like empty words, thin and useless. "What if you can't find him?" Sam asked, his voice cracking. The woman hesitated, her smile faltering for the first time. "We will, sweetie. It's just going to take some time." Sam wanted to believe her, wanted to hold on to the hope that his dad would walk through the door any minute, grinning sheepishly, and saying something about getting held up by airport security or losing his wallet. But with every tick of the clock, that hope slipped further away. They asked him more questions, where he lived, if there was anyone else they could call. His answers were stilted, robotic, like his mind had detached itself from his body. Eventually, the man left the room, leaving Sam alone with the woman. Her voice was gentle, her words meant to soothe, but Sam barely heard her. His gaze was fixed on the door, his heart pounding so hard it felt like it might break through his chest. He couldn't believe his dad would abandon him. But as the hours stretched on, and the night crept in, a horrible realization began to take root. Maybe his father had walked away with every intention of never coming back. The sun had long since disappeared behind the airport's towering structures, leaving the world cloaked in a chilly darkness. Sam's legs ached from sitting, but he didn't dare move. The backpack in his lap had grown heavier, the straps digging into his skin. The woman from earlier, Miss Gina, she told him her name was, had given him a blanket and some cookies she dug out from a vending machine. He'd nibbled at them without much interest, the dry crumbs sticking to his tongue. Hunger was a distant thing, shadowed by the heavier sensation pressing down on his chest. Miss Gina spoke to him every once in a while, her words gentle and probing, like she was trying to pry open a door he'd slammed shut. But Sam's answers were clipped, his voice dull and mechanical. The worst part was the waiting. The wait times seemed to stretch out endlessly, each minute an echo of the last. They'd tried calling his dad's number a few times. No answer. Not even voicemail. Just a hollow ring that went on forever before finally cutting off. When another man in a uniform appeared, this one with the security badge glinting from his chest, Sam's pulse spiked. He was tall, with broad shoulders, and a face creased with worry. "Hey there, buddy. Name's Officer Darnell," the man said, his voice rich and deep like something you'd hear in a movie. "Mind if I ask you a few questions?" Sam nodded, his eyes glued to the officer's face. There was something comforting about his presence, like maybe he really could make things right. "You're waiting for your dad, huh? David Thompson." "Yeah." Sam's voice came out shaky. "He said he'd be back. He told me to wait by the chairs, so I did. I waited like he said." Officer Darnell nodded, crouching down to be at eye level with Sam. "You did good, kid. You did exactly what you were supposed to do. But here's the thing. We've been looking all over the airport, checking the cameras, making announcements. Nobody's seen him." Sam's breath hitched, but he promised. "I know, son. And I believe you. Officer Darnell's eyes were steady, searching his face like he was trying to piece together a puzzle. Do you remember the last thing he said to you? Anything at all? He just told me to wait. Sam's voice cracked. He said he'd be back real soon, and then he walked away. I don't know where he went. Miss Gina exchanged a troubled glance with Officer Darnell, the kind of look adults used when they were trying to hide something bad. Sam's fingers twisted the straps of his backpack, the fabric straining under the pressure. Did your dad seem upset? Officer Darnell asked gently. Was he acting different? Sam blinked rapidly, his vision blurring. No, he was just normal. He was fine. Another silence, this one thick and heavy. We're gonna figure this out, Sam, Officer Darnell said, his voice like solid ground beneath Sam's feet. I'm not going anywhere until we do. And neither is Miss Gina here. You're not alone, kid. The words sank into him slowly, a small warmth against the chill wrapping itself around his bones. Now, Officer Darnell continued, is there anyone else we can call? Your mom, a grandparent, an aunt or uncle? Sam's fingers stilled, his eyes fixed on a scuff mark on the floor. It's just me and my dad. It's always been just us. Miss Gina's hand reached out, her fingers resting lightly on his shoulder. And where do you live, sweetheart? Maybe we can get someone to take you home. Home. The word sounded strange, like something he'd heard in a storybook. We move around a lot. My dad's trying to find work, and sometimes we stay at motels. But the last place, we had to leave because he couldn't pay. Miss Gina's face tightened, the concern etched even deeper. What about school? Do you go to school around here? Sam's cheeks flushed. No, we were going to start somewhere new. That's what he said. The adults exchanged another look, this one sharper, more urgent. What about your mom? Officer Darnell asked, his voice careful. Is she around? Sam shook his head, the movement jerky and unsteady. She died. When I was a baby. I don't remember her. For a moment, the room felt impossibly small, the air thick with something Sam couldn't name. Miss Gina's hand tightened slightly on his shoulder. Sam, I know this is scary. And you've been so brave, waiting like your dad told you. But right now, we need to make sure you're safe, okay? Safe. The word drifted around him like a leaf caught in the wind. What if? Sam's voice wavered. What if he's not coming back? The adults didn't answer right away. The silence was the worst part, a yawning gap filled with awful possibilities. Miss Gina cleared her throat. We're going to keep trying to reach him. But in the meantime, we have to make sure you're taken care of. Maybe stay somewhere you can get some rest, some food. Just for tonight. Panic gripped Sam's chest, his breathing turning shallow and frantic. I can't leave. What if he comes back, and I'm not here? What if he's looking for me? Officer Darnell crouched lower, his eyes full of a sincerity Sam wanted so badly to believe in. Kid, I promise you, if your dad shows up, we'll find him. But you've been here all day, and you need somewhere safe to sleep. But I don't want to leave. Sam's voice broke on the last word. Hey, Officer Darnell said softly. How about this? We can make sure someone's here to watch for your dad. If he shows up, they'll let us know right away. And if he calls the airport, we'll be the first to hear about it. Does that sound okay? Sam bit his lip so hard he tasted blood. His mind was a swirling storm of fear and exhaustion, but somewhere beneath all of that, a small part of him knew he was losing the battle against his own breaking heart. Okay, he whispered, but you have to promise to look for him. Promise you won't stop. I swear, kid, I won't stop, Officer Darnell said, his voice as steady as the earth itself. But even as Sam nodded, his trust felt paper thin. And deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that everything he'd ever known had just crumbled away. The night crept in, swallowing the airport in its shadowy embrace. Sam's limbs were heavy with exhaustion, but sleep refused to come. Instead, his thoughts tangled and twisted like thorny vines, trapping him in his own mind. They had taken him to a small office tucked away from the crowds. The walls were painted a bland beige, the fluorescent lights buzzing softly overhead. A couch sat against one wall, and Miss Jinnah had insisted he lie down, even coaxing him into accepting a sandwich and a bottle of water. But Sam had only nibbled at the bread, his stomach churning too much to eat. Every creak and whisper from the hallway made him jump, his eyes darting to the door, expecting his father to burst through at any moment with some wild, half-baked apology about getting lost or held up by security. But hours had passed, and the door remained closed. Officer Darnell checked in periodically, his calm presence a fragile lifeline Sam clung to. But even the officer's reassurances couldn't quiet the growing terror in his chest. Miss Jinnah's voice was low and soothing as she sat beside him on the couch. "You're doing so well, Sam. I know this must feel like a nightmare, but we're doing everything we can to find your dad." Did you check the cameras again?" Sam's voice was so small he barely recognized it as his own. "We did," Miss Jinnah said, "but there's nothing. It's like he just left." Sam's hands clenched the thin blanket she draped over him. The words scraped at him like sharp glass. Maybe he got lost," Sam whispered, desperate for something, anything, to hold on to. "We thought about that," Officer Darnell said from the doorway, his gaze steady. "But there's been no sign of him anywhere. It's like he just walked out of the airport and didn't come back. But he wouldn't leave me." Sam's eyes were wild, his breathing sharp and ragged. "He promised." "I know he did." Officer Darnell's voice was heavy, burdened by something Sam couldn't name. Sometimes grown-ups make mistakes, and when they do, it's not your fault." The implication twisted in Sam's gut, bitter and poisonous. His father was all he had. They might not have had much, but they had each other. That was the one thing Sam had always been certain of. "I need to find him," Sam said, his voice trembling but fierce. "He needs me." Officer Darnell's expression softened, his shoulders slumping just a little. "I'm going to keep looking, kid. I promise. But right now, you need to get some rest. You've had a rough day." Sam opened his mouth to argue, but his throat was too tight. He felt like a balloon stretched too thin, ready to burst. "Just try to sleep," Miss Jinnah murmured, her fingers lightly brushing his shoulder. "We're not giving up. Not by a long shot." Sam's eyelids felt like they were made of lead, his body's exhaustion finally winning out. The couch was lumpy and smelled faintly of disinfectant, but it was warm, and his body craved rest. When sleep finally claimed him, it was restless and haunted by dreams where he was running through endless airport corridors, his father's voice calling his name from just out of reach. He woke to the soft murmur of voices. Doesn't make any sense. Who leaves their child at an airport and just vanishes? Miss Jinnah's voice, sharp and frustrated. "I don't know," Officer Darnell replied, his tone grim. "But we checked all the exits. We even pulled footage from outside. It's like he just walked into the night and disappeared." Sam's breath hitched, the remnants of sleep scattering like ashes. He shifted on the couch, his heartbeat thundering in his chest. "Any luck reaching family members?" Miss Jinnah asked. "None. The kid's father had a phone, but it's either dead or turned off, and we can't find any other contacts. No relatives, no friends, nothing." Miss Jinnah let out a shaky breath. "What do we do then? Just leave him here? That poor child's been waiting all day and night. He's just a kid." "I know," Officer Darnell said, the words strained. "We can try child services, but that's not exactly a quick process. And if the father shows up? What if he doesn't?" Miss Jinnah snapped, her voice trembling. "What if something happened to him? What if he's lying in some ditch somewhere, or Jenna. Officer Darnell's tone was a firm anchor against her spiraling worry. We don't know anything for sure. And until we do, we have to proceed carefully. If we just hand Sam over to the system without exhausting every option, we could be making a huge mistake. Sam lay there, his body stiff with fear. They were talking about him like he wasn't even there, like he was a problem they didn't know how to solve. But the worst part was that they were right. His dad wasn't coming back. Not tonight. Maybe not ever. The realization struck him like a punch to the chest, knocking the air from his lungs. Sam. Miss Jenna's voice cut through the darkness of his thoughts, her face peering at him with concern. You're awake. He nodded slowly, the movement feeling like it required every ounce of strength he had left. Did you hear us talking? Officer Darnell asked, his expression unreadable. Yes. Sam's voice sounded hollow, the echo of something lost. Officer Darnell glanced at Miss Jenna, then back to Sam. I'm sorry you had to hear all that, kid. We're just trying to figure out what's best for you. Sam swallowed hard. What happens now? The question hung in the air, a sharp blade waiting to drop. Well, Officer Darnell's words were cautious, like he was afraid they'd break something already fragile. We're going to keep trying to find your dad. But in the meantime, we need to make sure you're okay, that you have somewhere safe to stay. Where? There's a place not far from here, Miss Jenna said softly. A shelter where kids can stay when their parents aren't around. Just for a little while, until we figure this out. Sam's heart sank. The word shelter felt like a heavy chain, one that threatened to drag him down into a darkness he couldn't escape. No, he whispered, his voice trembling. He'll come back. I know he will. Officer Darnell crouched down again, his eyes searching Sam's face. I hope you're right, Sam. I really do. But until then, we have to make sure you're safe. Sam wanted to argue, to scream and claw his way out of this nightmare. But his body was too tired, his mind too shattered. All right, he whispered, his voice broken. I'll go. But deep down, a seed of hope remained, stubborn and unyielding. And Sam knew that no matter what anyone said, he would never stop waiting for his dad to come back. The shelter was nothing like Sam had imagined. It wasn't the grim, crowded place with bars on the windows he pictured from watching too many TV shows. Instead, it was a large old house painted pale blue with white trim, sitting on the corner of a sleepy neighborhood. The yard was dotted with flower beds struggling to bloom despite the chill of early spring, their colors faded but persistent. Officer Darnell drove Sam there himself. The man kept glancing at him through the rearview mirror, eyes heavy with concern and words he couldn't seem to voice. Sam sat stiffly in the back seat, clutching his backpack to his chest like a shield, his stomach twisted with every bump in the road. When they pulled up to the shelter, a woman with frizzy red hair and kind eyes stepped out onto the porch. She was bundled up in a knitted cardigan that looked 3 sizes too big and smiled like she was trying to coax a wounded animal out from hiding. You must be Sam, she said, her voice warm and gentle. I'm Mrs. Alder. Welcome to Lilac House. Sam couldn't find the strength to respond. Instead, he nodded, his fingers digging into the frayed straps of his backpack. Officer Darnell placed a steady hand on Sam's shoulder as they walked up the steps. Mrs. Alder here will take good care of you, Sam. She's one of the best. The woman laughed softly, waving off the compliment. Well, I try my best. Come on in, sweetheart. You must be exhausted. Sam allowed himself to be led inside. The house smelled faintly of cinnamon and something floral he couldn't quite place. Pictures lined the walls. Drawings done by children in crayon and marker, framed like masterpieces. Some of them even had signatures scrawled in childish handwriting. This is the front room, Mrs. Alder said, gesturing around. And down that hall are the bedrooms. We've got a room set up just for you. Just for me? Sam asked, the words feeling foreign on his tongue. Well, for now. We're not overcrowded at the moment. You'll have some peace and quiet, at least until we figure things out." Sam's gaze drifted to the stairs. Voices echoed from the second floor. Sam clutched the cap to his chest and curled up on the bed, his knees pressed against his stomach. The tears came then, hot and bitter, staining the pillowcase beneath his cheek. He didn't remember falling asleep, but when he woke, darkness had seeped into every corner of the room. The only light came from the small lamp beside the bed, its glow thin and unreliable. There was a soft knock at the door. "Sam, you awake, honey?" He scrubbed at his face, wiping away the remnants of tears. "Yeah." Mrs. Alder stepped inside, holding a tray with a steaming bowl of soup and a slice of buttered bread. "I thought you might be hungry. Just something to keep your strength up." He considered refusing, but his stomach betrayed him with a low, traitorous rumble. "Thanks," he murmured. Mrs. Alder set the tray on the nightstand and sat down at the edge of the bed. Her gaze was gentle but searching. "It's okay to feel scared, you know. What you're going through, it's more than most adults could handle." "I'm not scared," Sam lied. His voice sounded small, like it had shrunk down to nothing. "Of course not," she said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "But if you ever want to talk, I'm here, day or night, and I'll be checking in on you, making sure you're okay." "Okay." She rose to her feet, her movements slow and careful. "Eat up, sweetheart. I'll be back to check on you soon." When she left, Sam stared at the food, his appetite already waning. But he forced himself to take a few bites, the warmth of the soup settling uneasily in his stomach. As he ate, his mind churned with 1,000 unanswered questions. His father's face haunted him, his smile now a distant memory blurred by grief and confusion. But one thought burned brighter than the rest. He had to find his dad. And if no one else was going to help him, he'd do it himself. The days at Lilac House blurred into one another, each one stretching endlessly as Sam tried to adjust to his new reality. Mrs. Alder's kindness was constant, like a soft melody playing beneath the noise of his restless thoughts. She never pushed him to talk, but she always made sure he was fed, clothed, and treated with a gentle respect that almost felt foreign. He had his own room, but the loneliness of it often felt like punishment. So he spent most of his time wandering through the shelter's narrow halls or sitting in the corner of the living room, where the other kids would gather to play board games or argue over the TV remote. They were a mixed group, all ages and backgrounds, united by one terrible truth: they'd been left behind. Sam never spoke to them, never introduced himself. He kept his distance, too wary of their easy laughter and friendly banter. Friendship was a luxury he couldn't afford, not when his father was still out there, waiting to be found. The nights were the worst. He'd lie awake, staring at the cracked ceiling, clutching his father's old baseball cap like it was some sort of talisman. Sometimes he'd whisper his father's name over and over, as if the sound of it alone could summon him back. But the only response was the wind rattling against the old house's windows. Officer Darnell visited a few times. Each time he looked more exhausted, his eyes shadowed with guilt and frustration. "Still no lead, Sam, but we're not giving up. You hear me? We'll find him." Sam would nod, his heart twisting painfully. But his faith in the system was already crumbling. If they hadn't found his dad by now, what hope was there? That was when he made his decision. If no one else was going to help him, then he'd help himself. He was 12, not some helpless little kid. His dad had taught him how to be strong, how to be smart, and Sam wasn't going to waste another day sitting around waiting for someone to save him. He started planning. Every night, while the other kids slept, he'd pore over the crumpled city map he'd found in one of the old bookshelves. He traced the routes he remembered his dad taking when he was between jobs, the shelters and cheap motels where they sometimes stayed. It was a long list, but Sam memorized it all. The hardest part was waiting for the right moment. Mrs. Alder kept a careful watch over him, her kindness as relentless as the chill of winter. She would always ask him how he was feeling, always offer him more food than he could stomach, always look at him with a tenderness that made his throat tighten. But one night, during a particularly noisy dinner, when the older kids were squabbling over whose turn it was to wash dishes, Sam slipped away. He grabbed his backpack, stuffed a few stolen granola bars inside, and crept out the back door. The air was sharp and cold, stinging his lungs as he ran. He didn't stop running until his legs ached, and his breath came in ragged gasps. The city at night was a different beast, its shadows longer, its noises harsher. Sam's fear pulsed just beneath his determination, but he kept moving. His father was out there somewhere. He had to be. For days, Sam roamed the streets, his thin frame swallowed up by the sprawling city. He checked the shelters first, always scanning the rows of tired faces for his father's familiar features. But his dad was nowhere to be found. Next, he went to the motels, slipping through the lobbies with the practiced ease of a kid who'd spent too much time on the move. He asked the clerks if they'd seen a man fitting his father's description. Some were kind, their eyes brimming with pity when they said no. Others dismissed him with cold indifference, their stares sliding past him like he was a ghost. Nights were the worst. Sam would find alleys to sleep in, wedging himself between dumpsters or crouching beneath stairwells. His stomach gnawed at him with hunger, but he'd grown used to the ache. It was the loneliness that threatened to break him, the silence that pressed down like a weight he couldn't lift. It was during one of those sleepless nights that he heard the voices. Two men standing at the end of the alley, their words low and rough. Sam huddled deeper into the shadows, his body tense with instinctual fear. Last seen near Crestwood. We should check there. Yeah, but the boss wants us keeping an eye out down here. Never know who might show up looking for him. The words lodged themselves in Sam's mind like thorns. Crestwood. His father had mentioned that place before. Something about a construction site he'd once worked at. Sam waited until the men had left before slipping out of the alley, his heart pounding. Crestwood. It was a lead, something real to hold on to. And he wasn't going to waste it. He spent the next day scrounging together what little money he had left, buying bus fare to Crestwood. The ride was long and bumpy, but his mind raced with possibility. If his father was there, if he was alive and waiting. But Crestwood was nothing like Sam had expected. The construction site was abandoned, its half-built structures looming like skeletons against the gray sky. He wandered through the rubble, his steps slow and uncertain. And then he saw him, a figure hunched against the cold, wrapped in a tattered coat that did nothing to shield him from the wind. His hair was matted, his beard overgrown. But even in his ragged state, Sam recognized him. Dad. The word tore from his throat, his voice splintering with hope and fear. The man looked up, his eyes widening with disbelief. Sam. His voice was a rasp, cracked and broken. But it was him. It was really him. Sam ran to his father, his small arms wrapping around the man's waist as sobs tore through him. His father held him tightly, his own tears mingling with the dirt and grime on his cheeks. I thought I lost you, Sam choked out. I thought you left me. Never, his father whispered. Never, Sam. I got lost. But I was looking for you. I was always looking for you. They stood there, clinging to each other in the shadow of the ruins, the city's noise fading into nothingness. In that moment, the world was only them. Two souls stitched back together by the sheer force of love and desperation. But Sam couldn't ignore the truth. His father was broken, damaged by whatever nightmare he'd been living through. And Sam was just a child. But he'd found him. Somehow, against all odds, he'd found him. Now, he just had to figure out how to bring him home.